Welcome to Intesa Sanpaolo On Air, the English Language Insights series jointly hosted by Intesa Sanpaolo and the University of Oxford, where we embark on global conversations with global leaders. My name is Rupert Younger, and in this episode, we will be discussing social impact, from how different organisations are structured to deliver social impact, what's happening in the world of mega philanthropy, and what social impact looks like in practice. So social impact refers to actions or initiatives that individuals, businesses, non-profits, and other entities make to address social challenges and improve people's lives. Individuals have long been the focal point for social impact. Philanthropists through the ages have been long-standing social impact contributors, and we now also see the growing importance of generosity movements like Giving Tuesday, enabling all of us as individuals to create impact at scale. Beyond individuals in this era of stakeholder capitalism, businesses are now also being evaluated on what they can contribute to society beyond the generation of profit for shareholders. And all of this is being supercharged by the immediacy of global information, which brings the needs of great causes to our attention through our smartphones 24 hours a day. Here to explore these themes are three brilliant individuals, each with unique experience and perspectives on social impact. First, let me welcome my colleague from here at the Said Business School in Oxford, Professor Marya Besharov.
Thanks. It's great to be here, Rupert.
Marya is Professor of Organisations and Impact and Academic Director of the Skoll Centre for Social Entrepreneurship. She's a leading voice on different organisational forms and how these connect with social impact. So welcome, Marya. Thank you so much for being with us. Now, also here with me today is Professor Stephan, who's the Director of the Marshall Institute at the London School of Economics. The Marshall Institute works with philanthropists to explore ways in which they can organise their time, their money, their ideas, their knowledge and their skills to best serve the public good, whether that be through giving or through social entrepreneurship. In addition, he runs the 100X Impact Accelerator, which attempts to identify and fund impact unicorns. He's also a former colleague of mine, having been the MBA director here at Oxford. Stephan, welcome.
Thank you, Rupert. It's a great pleasure to be back.
And I'm also really excited and pleased to have our third panelist joining us from Kyiv in Ukraine, where she's just arrived, and that's Reeve, who is Chief of Staff at one of the UK's largest flagship charities, the Halo Trust. Halo helps countries during and after conflict, whether that be through clearing minefields and unexploded shells, destroying stockpiles of weapons, or helping locate and remove improvised explosive devices. It also contributes to wider requirements for social impact through the longer-term rehabilitation of former conflict areas, creating partnerships to bring land back into safe use. Lucy's career has seen her posted to Afghanistan, Cambodia, and most recently Libya before her current role as Chief of Staff. Lucy, welcome.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
So I think it's a good place to start. Lucy, let's start by hearing, what are you doing in Ukraine?
Thanks, Rupert. So I'm here conducting one of my regular governance trips to our projects and programs around the world. I'm checking in with our leadership about strategy, stakeholder management, fundraising, etc. But in terms of what Halo's doing more broadly in Ukraine, we're currently employing 1,200 Ukrainian men and women to locate and clear mines, and also to educate Ukrainian people on the risks of when they come across explosive ordnance. We know from official reports from the Ukrainian government that 156,000 square kilometers in Ukraine, it's about 25% of its landmass, has seen conflict in the last 2 years, so needs to be checked for explosive hazards. And people are in immediate danger of being harmed by these explosives. We're seeing casualty numbers of about 1,500 people every year since the most recent iteration of this conflict. We have been here since 2015, following the Russian annexation of Crimea. So we've got a really strong foothold in the country. We're well known and respected by the relevant stakeholders, and we've got a great base of Ukrainian staff who are leading our efforts. That includes things like conflict mapping, which is us scraping data from open sources to pinpoint individual conflict points, creating thousands of data points to inform our work, but also the other work of life-saving NGOs across the country. And the big picture is we are working towards stability and reconstruction in Ukraine, bringing it back to social impact. Immediate life is protected, but also salaries are injected into conflict-affected communities when people's lives have been upended and their normal livelihoods disrupted. Once the mines have gone, communities can begin to rebuild infrastructure. They can rebuild their homes, roads, schools, and hospitals. And moreover, there's the international picture that we all know about, where international food security is shored up as more land is made safe in Ukraine. And it eases pressure on global supply chains for wheat, which is causing devastation in places like the Horn of Africa.
And of course, you're doing all this while a conflict is still ongoing, which is unusual for Halo, isn't it? It's normally the case that you'll go in when a conflict has perhaps ended. Talk to us about what life for the deminers is like in Ukraine when you're surrounded by and, in fact, impacted every day by the stories and the impact of the conflict.
It's tough. There's no way around it. That's one of the main things I'll tell people what it's like to be a deminer. You're on your hands and knees every day in the hot sun. You're doing this physically demanding work. But what makes it easier or makes it more tolerable is, first of all, being a deminer with Halo is an exercise of great trust. When you go into a minefield to do this really difficult, dangerous work, you are walking on ground that's been cleared by your colleagues before you. It's this exercise of trusting them implicitly with your life to go on and continue the work. And then when we finish our work, we hand it back to the beneficiary communities, and they have to trust us that we've done the job correctly. So when trust is broken and lives have been torn apart, the work we're doing is actually rebuilding trust in the communities. The other thing I'd say is that being a deminer is about having a sense of identity. So we know that conflict can strip people of their identity. You could be an academic, you could be a teacher, you could be a doctor, an engineer. And if conflict comes to your community, it can take all of that away from you. However, when you work for a Halo as a deminer, it's an opportunity to once again have a dignified livelihood with a reliable salary, with sick pay, with training, with progression opportunities. And you're able to seize control of your own destiny by clearing the mines from your own land. And it's really a strong exercise of identity that I believe, from my personal experience of clearing mines in Cambodia, makes going out there in the hot sun, digging in the ground a little bit easier.
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you and congratulations for everything you're doing in this extraordinary part of the world, a very challenging place. Now, Stephan, I'm going to come to you if I may, because, I mean, you may want to comment, of course, on what Lucy says and what resonates about what's in Ukraine, but I think maybe also I'd be quite interested for you to think about or introduce to us the ideas as to what philanthropists that you work with are saying about the social impact challenges more broadly.
So I was very struck by what Lucy said about conflict robbing people of their identity, because that's also true of poverty and disease and all kinds of negative social impacts. So perhaps it's worth saying the most obvious thing that there is to say about this conversation, which is that when we talk about social impact, we're talking about positive, pro-social impact that makes people's lives safer and better. Because everything that we do has impact, and everything we do has social impact. And what's happening in philanthropy is people are starting to get really serious about moving money at the scale of the problem. There is this thing which goes under the slightly jargony name of big bet philanthropy, which was not something anyone talked about a decade ago. These are syndicates of big foundations who are collectively trying to move a lot more money than has typically been moved before. And they are typically doing so slightly further upstream of the things that Lucy has been talking about. They're trying to do what, again, in the jargon is called system-level interventions. So they're not going in to repair an immediate and acute crisis. They're going in to change the nature of the equilibrium that applies more generally. And if you look at the money deployed recently by Mackenzie Scott or the syndication of Co-Impact or the Audacious Prize, this is money for the first time really being moved at the scale of the problem. Now, that doesn't mean that any of this is over. So one of the things worth remembering is that all the philanthropy in the world is minuscule when compared to all the government budgets of the world. And all the government budgets of the world are, if not minuscule, then probably not up to the order of the challenges. Okay? So we need to be quite serious about sizing these problems. And when we talk, I think, misguidedly about, ending world poverty or solving the climate challenge, we need to be a bit careful, okay? Because that's one way to disappoint each other and one way to reduce the effectiveness of interventions.
So the scale of the challenge is perhaps underestimated and under-discussed. And I mean, perhaps, Marya, this brings you in because you are a leading authority, if I may, on this question of systems and structures, forms of organizational intervention, but also system change. Talk us a bit about what Stephan's just mentioned about the scale of the challenge and whether we actually need a fundamental rethink of systems in order to tackle these big global challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to pick up on, Stephan, what you said about how philanthropy is changing, right? The big bet approach, the understanding that this is really a systems challenge and we need a more coordinated, larger scale, more systemic approach from the financing side, philanthropy and other sources of financing. Because we're seeing in parallel a development on the, if I will call them, operating organization side, right? The social enterprises working on the ground, like Halo and many others. They too are recognizing that this is systemic, right? And they can't work alone either. And if we trace, and we have in our research traced the shifts in how social entrepreneurs and social innovators approach the problems they're addressing, they're increasingly thinking differently about them. So they're not talking about their venture's success in addressing an issue, but about how they are working with others in that particular problem area, whether it's climate, whether it's working in post-conflict and post-conflict zones, whether it's around economic development, whether it's in education. They are seeing those problems differently.
So I'm really fascinated by this because you introduced this word of or this idea that they're talking about what they're doing differently. And what I'm picking up from this is that they're mentioning much more about how they need to collaborate and cooperate with partners to achieve the systemic impact and change that's required. Is that an accurate summary of what you're trying to get across?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, though, that they're talking about that and they're trying, and there's so many barriers. Right. And I'll just highlight two. So one is they can't ignore that they want their organization to succeed, right? And there's this balance of they're working with people who in some sense are competitors, and they know they shouldn't see them as competitors, but they kind of do, right? And so there's this co-opetition dynamic. I mean, we see this in businesses all the time that they have to grapple with and come to terms with. And there's a challenge with the way funding is allocated, right? That even as Stephan has told us, and I completely agree, there's this real effort to think systemically, to join forces. There's still a lot of money that goes to specific programs that single organizations are doing that assesses impact in the short term. And that is getting in the way too. It's changing, but it's still there, and it needs to change faster.
What I think we're trying to do is to move away from a world in which somebody had the answer to everything. And you backed that person, and then you waited 10 years, and then you realized the problem was more complicated than the answer proposed. And then you went back round again. So we're trying to get people to think much, much harder about cooperation, collaboration, understanding and parsing the nature of people's experience of the problem, rather than saying, I've got a brilliant idea, it's the answer to everything. But just as we do that, then we also have to remind ourselves that this stuff is hard, painful, difficult, lonely work. And if you don't have, as it were, unreasonable ambition, okay, you're probably going to fail too. So somehow you have to balance this notion of unreasonableness, because, otherwise you wouldn't be tackling really, really difficult things like demining and post-conflict parts of the world, with this necessary kind of imperative of a kind of joined up modesty.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, this question, isn't it, about the skill sets that partners bring, because different partners bring different things. It's not, of course, all just about money. Money is, of course, a phenomenal enabler, but often it's skill sets as well. Everything that we're talking about now, if we're rebuilding or clearing mines in Angola, or if we're rebuilding environmental protection in different parts of the world, surely these are state things. Surely these should be done by the government and not done by businesses. Why are businesses having to play a role, either with people or money or expertise? Why?
Well, I think there are a couple of answers to that. Let's think about what this kind of private capital can do that state capital can't. Okay, one of those things is do experiments, okay, and take risks and fail. If you're a government, you can't do big experiments that are likely to fail, particularly in democratic systems, because you'll get voted out or down. The whole point of philanthropy is that it ought to be risk-bearing capital. And when market actors, when companies do this kind of work, it's for public benefit. So it ought to have a high tolerance for failure. And we know how capital structures and risk work. Okay, that developed capitalist economies understand that. What we haven't yet figured out is how this capital stack works in philanthropy, where I take a risk with my $5 that it might get misused, and then my richer virtual twin takes a risk with their £50, and so on, all the way up to big foundations. And we need to think more carefully about what that capital stack looks like. And what Lucy was talking about is super important, because the one thing we know is that however good you are at philanthropy and however rich you are, let's say you were the IKEA Foundation plus Mackenzie Scott plus the Gates Foundation. None of that is going to work unless somebody adopts the solutions that you are developing. And that somebody is almost certainly the state. Okay? So subsequent adoption by either market or state actors is absolutely critical to the success of philanthropic interventions. We should be failing more, risking more at the beginning, and failing less and following on more at the state adoption level. And it's super important. I mean, if there's one thing that I care most deeply about in this conversation, it's that there needs to be an orderly capital structure for impact interventions.
Okay, great. I'm going to take a different tack on this because I think this reflects my background and training as an organization theorist coming out of sociology, which is, there's another way to see sort of why business should play a role here and what the value add is, if you will, from an organizational perspective in terms of their capacity, right? That not just sort of what capital can be brought to the table and where does that fit in the capital stack, but what kinds of organizational capabilities does business bring? And for what kinds of social problems are those capabilities well suited? Because there's a whole set of problems, and I would call them technical problems, where it's about resources, it's about a technology, it's about efficient operation and repeated low uncertainty activity. That's actually what's needed to solve or tackle the social issue. And there is a clear role for businesses in terms of the operational and organizational capability that they bring. There's a whole other set of problems where it's a bit less obvious, right? More relational problems, complex, intertwined issues that have cultural norms at play, that have long histories of power dynamics in particular settings. You need to know the context. What to do is uncertain. How long it will take is uncertain, involving many players. It's not obvious that the business toolkit is the right fit there. The resources from business might be useful there, but you need to bring a different organizational toolkit. And so
give us an example of what a different organizational form might look like.
Yeah. Okay. So I like to think about sort of pure forms and hybrid forms. And the sort of archetype of business is as the pure form that's market focused, and the archetype of the nonprofit is sort of the pure social welfare focus. There's a huge space in the middle. And that is the space that I have looked at, that the Skoll Center works with. These hybrids are blending aspects of the market and aspects of the social sector. And what does that mean? Just to go back to how Lucy was describing Halo, Lucy, you talked about having local staff, having a deep understanding of the context, having a history in the area. That is a really critical piece that needs to be in this sort of hybrid mix if you're going to take on these complex relational issues. At the same time, you have to be thinking about how will we scale this, reduce uncertainty over time, make this something that can have impact at a broader scale in a more efficient way, if you will, right? And because you're learning from what you're doing in Ukraine, what you've done before in Ukraine, what you're doing in Angola and in other areas, over time, you harness that learning and you adapt and evolve, and that's what enables you to have bigger impact. And that part of the orientation is the piece that's coming from the business side. And so the hybrid really combines the two. It's not easy, right? There's often a lot of conflict because you're drawing on skill sets and people who are often coming from really different institutional worlds. But it's where there's a lot of potential.
And Lucy, is this something? I mean, this is interesting, right? Because you come across different organizational forms as partners, funders, states at one end. Talk us through your experience in terms of what Marya is saying about different organizational forms.
Yeah, Marya, I think that's so interesting what you're saying, because Halo will sometimes find itself in a very unique position to have convening power. Certainly in places where it's difficult for other people to have a footprint. An example I'd give is Somalia, where we are deploying hundreds of deminers in the field. We are in this position to bring people together to work in a collaborative way to serve those communities, be it in-kind donations, be it knowledge, be it technology for demining, be it even education about preserving frankincense in very remote parts of Somalia, where Halo is also clearing landmines. People wouldn't necessarily think to come to us first for a project like that, but our unique positioning means that we're able to bring those different strands together in some of the most fragile and difficult to reach places on Earth.
I really like this idea of trust being a unifying theme. Is that something, Marya, that you think could be deployed into weaving this idea of what's the connection between these different hybrid forms? What's the glue or the oil that can connect these things together? Is trust something that you see as being important in uniting these different organizational forms for impact, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, trust is critical. It's critical within, especially in the hybrid forms, right? Because they are, by design, bringing together people who don't see eye to eye, who come at a problem
and
differently.
And they're ambiguous, right, as well. So
yes.
People actually don't quite know what the other side looks like.
Yeah, and you have to go with it, right? You have to buy that. You have to have the trust. So it's absolutely critical there. And it's critical in the partnership work that Lucy described.
Lucy, you...
Yeah, just to add, as a question that you put to Stephan about why should private sector actors play a role in social impact, and picking up on the trust narrative, I think there's a greater desire from society as a whole to see private actors engaging in this. As consumers, we would like to trust places where we are putting our capital, and there is an expectation that they will do the right thing. And I also think that will shape philanthropic forecasting for the future. Your sustainability is only guaranteed if it's ethical. And I think that in the philanthropy space, people are understanding that more and more, which is why I think it's a really exciting area for growth.
Stephan?
I'm going to do that very annoying thing. I'm going to say yes, but. Okay. So I've been trying to find things to disagree with all afternoon. And I think I've found a small wrinkle of one, which is this question of trust, because it depends, of course, on who's trusting whom for what. And one of the things that philanthropy has been particularly bad at is trusting both the people who execute the project and specifically the people who have the voice, that is, the people whose problem it is we seek to address. And one of the hopeful things that's going on in big philanthropy certainly is some attempt to give agency to the people on whose behalf we claim to speak, and some attempt to bring down the barriers the kind of operational barriers for the NGOs or the enterprises, because I think that the field has been characterized by a lack of trust, to be absolutely frank. We've had a rerunning of what happened in big development, where you sit in DC or you sit in Geneva and you figure out what someone's problem is, and you think that it's the problem of capital, and you think that the answers are technocratic, okay? And then you find out about 6 years later that nothing worked because no one spoke to the people who actually live the thing. So yes, of course, trust is important, but no, I'm not sure we're there yet.
Marya.
Yeah, I would just add, I completely agree. We're not there yet. And it's not only about trust. It's how do we bring trust in alongside accountability? And I think we've had probably too much on accountability and not enough on trust, but it doesn't mean we're substituting one for the other.
Now, on accountability, can I bring it onto this knotty question of accountability and reporting? And I guess social impact evaluation. Lucy, I'm going to start with you because you spend a lot of your time preparing impact reports for donors, for benefit, for all sorts of players. How do you think about this question of evaluation? Is it done well? Is it done badly? What are the best practices?
It's an interesting question because different donors want different outcomes. They come into projects with us seeking different impacts. For example, some would like stabilization outcomes. Some would like more humanitarian outcomes, so rapid interventions that save lives immediately. Some want development outcomes. So you have to tailor your impact measuring to what the donor is seeking. I like to think of it as a ripple effect when you throw a stone in a lake. So the stone for Halo is our core output. So how many meters squared have you cleared of explosive hazards? How many explosive items did you destroy in the process of that? And how many beneficiaries has that benefited? So that's the basic numbers game. But the numbers don't always tell the story. We know this. And it's incumbent upon us to go beyond the numbers and to communicate the deeper meaning of our work. So what we mean by that is, yes, the immediate protection of life and limb is secured. But what about post-clearance land use? What is that land being used for? Has a cleared minefield opened up access routes so people can go back to the center of their communities and visit religious sites or be reunited with their families? Can commercial enterprises set up? There's an iconic picture of Prince Harry walking through a minefield that was cleared by Halo. And 20 years earlier, his mother, Princess Diana, walked through when the hazards were still there. The transformation in that was indescribable. Roads, hospitals, schools, sewage, communications towers, that is impact that can be very easily measured. The psychological and social impact, are people anxious about their children playing football outside? Has that gone now that the mines are cleared? People feel more connected to their community. So then, the ripples are getting bigger and bigger. You're going from the individual number of beneficiaries to the community, and you can widen that out all the way to country level. Now, Mozambique is a country that Halo, as well as other operators, conducted clearance of explosives, and the country was declared mine impact free completely in 2015. And very in-depth studies show that the country's GDP per capita in 2015 would have been anywhere between 18 to 25% lower in extreme cases if clearance hadn't taken place. So quantifying it all the way from the stone all the way out to the broad ripples at the edge of the lake is what we're talking about when we measure impact.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. Stephan.
Yeah, I mean, look, no one would claim that it's not important to have some sense of what you're doing and why, and how you might know whether you're doing it. But one of the things that's going on in big philanthropy is organizations are being put under enormous pressure to measure stuff that they know not to be worth measuring, and to report on stuff that is, has weak signals at best and is completely spurious at worst. And the reason is that we've moved from a position in which nobody measured stuff, so we didn't know, okay, to a position in which we think that causation and attribution are simple and linear, okay? And there's a difference between measuring who's got polio and measuring pro-democracy activism. And not everything is susceptible to a randomized control trial. It's usually the case that it's worth having a think about what the counterfactuals are. In other words, what might have happened had we done something else or not done anything at all. But we have to be careful not to substitute, as it were, radical imprecision for fictional precision.
Mariah.
Yeah, I just want to offer one a bit of an example of something that we're working on that I think speaks to this. So I'm seeing this move too, this sort of move to precision. We can get the KPIs, we can do the randomized controlled trial in some cases, or we try to get as close as we can. And if we really want to understand all of the ripple effects or the causal chain, sometimes we need a story, right, and a narrative. And we're working, the Skoll Center we're working with the old fire station, which is a social enterprise locally here in Oxford that has started to use this as their main way of measuring impact, storytelling. And they talk about it as meaningful measurement. And what we're seeing is, perhaps not surprisingly, at first, there was a lot of fear that this would not be totally rejected by funders, right, who still want the KPIs. And they had the courage just in one initial conversation with one funder to try it and to say, we've done your measures, but we think this is actually a useful way of measuring our impact. And just take a look. And it completely changed the conversation with that funder, who found it incredibly useful for understanding what the organization was doing and how it mattered and what impact it was having. And they're starting now to not only use it with other funders, but teach other organizations and funders how to do this.
So give us an example of what a story would be.
So the Old Fire Station is an organization that houses an art gallery, but also a homelessness center. And so some of the stories there are about the transformed experience of the people who are homeless, who are coming in, who may now be volunteering to do some work in the gallery, who are encountering art patrons coming in, and how it's completely changed their sense of self, their confidence, how they show up in the world, and what they end up going on to do, and really in ways that change their lives. And so those are some of the kinds of narratives.
I think it's incredibly powerful. I mean, stories, of course, lie at the heart of what it means to be human. It lies at the heart of connectivity between people and ideas. So storytelling, when told like that, it can be interpreted in many different ways by different. It's flexible enough to actually meet many, many different donors' needs. Stephan, you had a...
No. I was just going to say stories are data with soul.
Data with soul. Brilliant. We're running out of time, so let me just ask each of you, if I may, one question. What should we be hopeful about in the social impact space? Let me start with you, Lucy.
I'm hopeful about emerging generations of philanthropists around the world. By nature of Halo's footprint, we're so embedded in places that have suffered because of conflict, and to see rising from the embers of war flames of philanthropic interest that's homegrown is very inspiring to me. And I think we can see more of that in the future.
I agree. Very inspiring. Stephan?
I think rather unhopefully that the world will always face, really quite serious challenges to human flourishing. But what gives me hope and confidence is that we are beginning to understand a little bit better all the time about some of the root causes and connections of those problems, and therefore some of the kind of necessary interventions.
Mariah, the final word.
Okay. It's two developments in concert. So the first is that social impact and social entrepreneurship have really gone from the margins to the mainstream. I mean, we're having this conversation. Businesses, C-suite executives globally are thinking about this, right? This is a mainstream issue now. And that's huge. That opens up resources, attention, capabilities. And at the same time, there are more radicals and idealists on the margin. And we need both of those, right? If we just had one, we wouldn't get there because we have to shift within our existing ways of doing things and we have to imagine totally new ones. So it's the combination of the growth of the mainstream and the ever more active vocal idealists together.
Well, one thing's for sure is that there's a lot to be hopeful about and a huge challenge to meet. I'd like to thank all three of these wonderful guests. Thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise. Lucy, stay safe in Ukraine and carry on with the incredible work that Halo does. Stephan, Marya, thank you both very much for being here with us in Oxford. Thank you.